Thank you very much indeed for the kind invitation, the introduction, and the opportunity to speak here today. I aim to do my best in the coming 25 minutes to give you some introductory ideas on the geopolitics of technology, but I'll zoom into technical standards, since this is a new study, as has been mentioned. Just to sort of tease a bit out in more concrete what that could imply for our world now, but also in the near future. For this, I will proceed in 4 steps. First, I'll be rather brief on a paradigm shift from the weaponization and describe this weaponization of what has been called a flattening world. So this is more sort of giving context. Second, I will aim to conceptualize a little bit the challenge with regard to technology, more specifically, and then use that conceptualization to run this case study of the geopolitics of technical standardization and the power that emerges from it for states. And then conclude with a couple of thoughts, 3 challenges arising from that: politicization, fragmentation, and a power shift, and zoom in on the role of China. And as just been mentioned, my focus is the People's Republic of China and its appearance on the world stage, its implications for the European Union in particular, with a view on technology. So let's jump right into it. This paradigm shift, what does it imply? I mean, only in 2005, this isn't that long ago, Thomas Friedman published his book, The World is Flat, and this is why I'm saying the weaponization of the flattening world. So this idea that globalization is essentially can be reversed, that we live in a community of shared destiny, to pick up here a Chinese way to put it, and that essentially a number of things, including connectivity, are essentially global public goods. So that competition is of course there, obviously, but that sort of we have reached a level of interdependence that certain aspects are sort of out of the equation, simply because it would be too costly to compete over them and use them for our own single private interests. In 2019, I think Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman have written probably sort of the most important piece that describes how this has massively changed when they speak of the weaponized interdependence. So interdependence all of a sudden is no longer sort of a stabilizing force in international affairs, but it is a paradigm shift in the sense that aspects that have been that we used to look through maybe a cooperative, maybe a competitive, but certainly not sort of a rivaling sense, that those have all of a sudden become subject of sort of careful scrutiny to check whether dependence is equally distributed and whether we can use advantages we have over potential rivals and use them sort of to further our own goals and our own interests. What has led to that development? I think several aspects. I'll just name 3 of them. I think to some extent China's rise. I think what I mean is that as long as we had a very clear unipolar moment with the United States dominating, it was much easier for everyone to sort of align to this idea of a flat world, where bandwagoning cooperation was sort of seen a bit as being without alternative. But with China being sort of a second pole, things have started to move, people start to see sort of that there may be more than one option. There is an alternative. So it has started people to think about how precisely they can make use of this interdependent world to their best advantage. The second aspect, I think, is the digital transformation of the economy, of security issues, but also of the society. So something that we have been discussing actually in the early 2000s under the term network power. So the idea here is that what you need to control or further your power and influence has changed. It may not be the number of tanks or the number of nukes, even though I'm not saying that those aspects are irrelevant. With a view on Russia and Ukraine today, of course, we see that this is still relevant. But of course, there is quite a number of other aspects that have come into the equation, where the question where you actually placed within a network, be it a network through which goods flow, through which people flow, through which data flows, whatever. But that sort of this aspect of discussing how much you control essentially that structure, that infrastructure in many cases, and where you are placed in the network has become increasingly important under the conditions of a digital transformation that has certainly started, but it's still unfolding. So it will become even more impactful in the near future. And states already sort of foresee that and adapt their own strategies. I think since I'm talking here to primarily Swiss audience, I think it's worth mentioning Heiko Borchert, who is based in Switzerland, who has described this, I think, very accurately, and with the term flow control. So the ambition for states to aim to try and control flows of data, flows of goods, state of services, of people, of financial resources. And then finally, I think we see really here is, and that relates to it, a geo-economic struggle and an infrastructure competition. I think these are really important arenas of that struggle under conditions of the digital transformation. Now, Farrell and Newman have formulated two important sort of mechanisms, if you like, of that weaponized interdependence. One is what they call panopticon, and the other is what they call choke points. So one is that by aiming to control those aspects of interdependence, you want to gather information and you want to make use essentially of choke points, meaning that you are the one who's aiming to control how much data, how much goods, etc., are actually able to flow to a certain partner. So essentially, you can always control how much of the respective good does that other actor is able to access. So essentially, playing here with the ability to shape the flow of goods, of data, etc., what Borchert calls flow control. So in that aspect, it's really about information and utilizing the dependence in strategic sectors. And there are examples for that. China's approach to erect a dual circulation strategy is just sort of one defensive aspect where China aims to adapt to this new situation, tries to be less dependent on exactly those flows and be more self-reliant. At the core of this discussion are, in light of this digital transformation, either foundational technologies such as semiconductors or cutting-edge technologies, artificial intelligence, IoT, 5G, or blockchain, and others. Now, let's conceptualize a bit sort of what arises from this, from a technology viewpoint. Because, I mean, I think although this geopolitical turn is going on for a few years now, we still find ourselves sort of considering a little bit and asking a bit ourselves very often, technology we use to sort of not see particularly through a political lens. So how does it matter here in terms of power politics and the struggle between the United States, China, potentially also the EU and others? And I think there's 4 dimensions to consider. One is economic. The ability to control standard setting, infrastructure, digital infrastructure, etc., is becoming more and more an issue sort of economic competitiveness of countries. And in that sense, obviously, it is in the very best interest of states, since they should care about the economic well-being of their societies and their economy, to make sure they are well placed and also have an advantage over others in that to remain competitive. So this is a very classical field, obviously, but it's still in the equation. There's a security angle here as well, meaning that if you are, I mean, we have been discussing this with regard to the 5G rollout and the question whether to include Chinese suppliers in that in the European Union, also in the United States, but the US has made up its mind much quicker about this. That, of course, in an interconnected society, you face new risks of network security. The same can be said about IT security, and sort of given the digital transformation, obviously the consequences of insecurities in those fields are much more severe. So this is why, also from a national security point of view, I think this geopolitical turn of technology matters. It's not just seen as sort of an economic enabler, but it's also seen as a potential national security vulnerability. When I speak here as the third category of a political implication, then of course everything is political here. So maybe there's a better term to phrase it. But if we sort of go back to the issues of economic competitiveness, then obviously what is also at stake here is political dependencies and the questions: to what extent are we forced to accept political agendas of potential competitors, potential rivals that can simply draw on economic advantages, on technological lock-in effects to make sure we conform or at least align with the political preferences, the core interests of those countries. So, of course, we have been discussing this with regard to China as well, and the question whether technological and economic dependencies could lead third countries to be very, very reluctant to go against Chinese core interests in terms of, say, the Taiwan question, etc. And finally, I think there's an ideation, also a values dimension here, because the fact is that technology isn't value free. You can prioritize different angles within technology. So, and since technology is shaping our societies more and more, and I'll bring a bit more detail to that when I speak about technical standards, then this ideational dimension can also shape sort of the normative system in which we live and operate. Now let's use that template here to look into one case study, namely the geopolitics of what I call standardization power. What is a technical standard? Very briefly, before I sort of explain a bit the politics around it. technical standards surround us. They are everywhere. I have displayed here sort of two standards, one that has been very successful, USB, a standard for cables that we all know to charge, to transmit data from one device to another, etc. So that has been a very successful standard. We don't really think about it. It's global, and we use it. Good. On the right-hand side, however, you see a power charger, and you see where we haven't been able to form a global standard, because you all know this from traveling around the globe, that sometimes you come to a country and you can't use the power plug anymore, and then you need those adapters. I mean, it's not that every country has a different system, but obviously the world hasn't been able to agree on that. Now the question is, of course, why does it matter whether USB has come from the US, from the EU, from Switzerland, or from China? Well, I mean, technical standards in itself are inclusive. So technical standards are, if they are formal standards, at least negotiated in international standard developing organizations, where in general everyone has access to. There's also de facto standards, for example, the Windows system or Max OS. They are, of course, de facto standards. You don't really have many alternatives. But these are, I call them de facto standards here. So not everything is inclusive, but at least the formal development in international organizations is quite inclusive. Standards are also voluntary. There's no one who has ever made a legally binding decision that we need to use USB. It was simply adopted. It was sort of offered by an SDO, and then the question was, do we overtake it or not? And it found wide market and consumer acceptance. And it's private self-regulation to the extent that technical standards are by and large negotiated among companies and not states. So in that sense, you could say it may not be a natural case where this geopolitics of technology plays out, but in fact it does, as I will explain in a minute. What I do want to say is that technical standards is not just a case that is a singular peripheral one. Technical standards shape and impact around 80% of global trade. International technical standards developed by international standard developing organizations, such as the International Standardization Organization or the International Electrotechnical Committee, both being based in Geneva, in Switzerland, are actually benchmarks for world trade law that can be used in the dispute settlement body of the World Trade Organization. Let's jump sort of into and explain a bit in those 4 dimensions how is this geopolitical turn of technical standards now playing out? Because as I just said, I mean, they're inclusive, they're voluntary, they're private. So how the hell are states really using technical standards to further their power? Well, as I said, the first dimension is economic competitiveness. And here the mechanisms are very clear. We have essentially distributary effects at play. One is patenting. Technical standards in general are accessible to everyone, but with the digital transformation, we find a higher and higher share of technical standards to be patented. 55% of ICT standards are patents, rely on patents. We call them standard essential patents. In those standard essential patents, if you declare a standard to be, or if you declare the willingness of standard to be a patent to be standard essential, I got it. Sorry. You agree to licenses under so-called friend terms. fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. But that doesn't imply that this does not come with enormous distributory effects. For example, a company like US's Qualcomm is making around 20% of its revenue with licensing its patents. So that has an enormous impact on. Another aspect is adoption costs. So you need to adapt your own technology, if it doesn't conform to an international standard, to that standard in order to remain competitive on world markets. Because what it does is a technical standard allows your own technology to be able to correspond or interact, we call it interoperability, with other technological solutions from other suppliers, potentially from other countries. So in that sense, what you could see is if your own proposal for a technical standard upon which your own product is being, your own technology is being based, and that is not successful, you need to, of course, make sure your own technology still is able to interact with the based on that international standard with the products of others. So you have to adapt your own technology, and that may come with costs. And we have had quite a number of such cases where we had such competition in the 70s already between Betamax and VHS for the video format, or also with telecommunications, where we had in the third generation the competition between TD, SCDMA, WCDMA, and CDMA 2000, essentially reflecting here China, the United States, and Europe competing for that. Back then, sort of essentially the Europeans prevailed. So to sum up, in the economic dimension, it's really about competitiveness. It's a distributory aspect. It's the question for companies, of course, but also for whole national economies. The second dimension is the political and the dependencies that I described earlier. So one aspect here is regulating trade. So you want to make sure with your technical standards that either them being international standards, or if you're a large political entity, again, China, US, EU, the leading ones, to make sure that your technical standards uphold, maybe not just in your own jurisdiction, but that others, particular multinational companies who want to access your market, may also apply the same technical standards elsewhere. That's, for example, what IKEA does. It goes around the world, it looks at relevant standards for it, furniture standards, and it considers whether it can find one standard that applies around the world, where it can sell the same table in China, in the EU, in the US. And if, say, the EU has the strictest standard of all the three entities, but complying with that standard implies also complying with the standards in the US and China, IKEA will adopt then the EU standard. So that's just one example of how even standards within one jurisdiction can have extraterritorial effects. So in that sense, you can impose sort of your own regulation either through international standard or through the market power of the standard you've set in your own entity for extraterritorial use. And then a second and maybe even more important aspect is lock-in effects. That speaks directly to the dependency aspect in this political dimension. And here an example is that China has been built railway projects as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, where you get the financing for those railway projects, coupled, however, under the condition with the fact that those countries, the recipient countries, have to adopt Chinese railway standards. That implies, in turn, since Chinese railway standards and European and US standards are quite different, that those recipient countries for the maintenance of that projects can turn to US or EU suppliers. They're really locked into Chinese suppliers. And then, of course, the question is, do you as a political leadership feel you can afford the fact that afford criticizing China under conditions where you know that your own critical infrastructure depends on maintenance from a state-owned company in China? The same, of course, is this is a general pattern. It can't just apply to China, but I think this is a good example. The third dimension is the security dimension, IT, cyber, and beyond, as I said. Or I think that is quite straightforward. We have had discussions about espionage and sabotage in our consideration of 5G networks in Europe. But just to remind you here, you could have technical standards being very precise or quite broad and unspecific. One issue we have with a relatively vague standard is, for example, for cameras in the industrial cleaning robots, where these standards are supposed to ensure that the supplier can't really have any access of information to the camera pictures that are being taken by the industrial cleaning robot. But the standard is vague enough to not exclude that risk. In that sense, the question how an international technical standard is being formulated can have an impact on espionage, on this espionage angle. On the sabotage side of things, it's, I think, very straightforward that cryptography standards are aspects that also actually the NSA from the United States has been trying to tap into and include its own agenda into it. Fourth and finally, on the ideational dimension, the values dimension, you see sort of a normalizing effect of technical standards. So an international standard that is widely adopted may sort of shape the question, what we expect from a technology. One example is the Wi-Fi that we are all used to, but that wasn't without alternative. China offered the WAPI standard that is worse in protecting privacy, but claims at least to be better in performance. So what we see here is what kind of technology you accept in that arena does have an impact on the question, sort of how much value you attribute to privacy. And of course, there's also a reputational aspect. You can strengthen your soft power if you're considered an innovation leader that is able to set technical standards. This is my last slide, and given the time, I'll be quite quick here on this. What I want to say here is, of course, China's rise has an impact on this technical standardization domain in at least three aspects. First, it is politicizing it since it does not follow the dominant approach that is privately driven to technical standard setting. It has a much more state-centric approach. And the already ongoing politicization is, of course, just being furthered if one of the important actors is setting standards primarily through political institutions. The second is the fragmentation that, of course, we have always had competing international technical standards, but as a sort of as a follow-up or as a consequence of politicization, if we start to consider more and more the origin of technical standards and not just the nature, sort of the technical nature of technical standards, then we risk of a fragmenting international technical standardization scene. And finally, a power shift. Of course, we do see that sort of through specific means. Again, public actors playing a huge role here. We tend to see a shift sort of influence from Europe primarily to China, and that should concern us Europeans as well. Could go in more detail, but given the time, I'll leave that for the discussion and end up here. If you want to read the report, the latest one that has been mentioned when I was introduced, you can find it online. You find the QR code here and the cover picture as well on this final slide. Thank you so much.